To come this hour, 25,000 of the fire doors blamed for the Grenfell fire tragedy are still in use in social housing across the country. We'll be hearing from a Grenfell campaigner here in the studio. Tens of thousands of fire doors identical to those blamed for the spread of the Grenfell Tower fire are still in use in public housing across the country. It's thought at least 25,000 doors of the types which failed testing in the aftermath of Grenfell are still in use. The information comes from a Freedom of Information request sent to 123 local authorities, and the number could be much higher, as many councils admitted to not keeping data on file. It comes as Grenfell survivors call on the government to change social housing regulations and set up a watchdog with the power to jail negligent housing managers. Now, they want changes as thorough as those made to banking following the 2008 financial crash. Meanwhile, housing charity Shelter has released a report urging the government to build 3 million more social homes over the next 20 years. The government is currently building 130,000 homes a year, well short of its own target of 300,000. Well, for more on all of this, I'm now joined by Grenfell campaigner Professor Chris Imafidon. Chris, your reaction to the number of doors that are still in operation that clearly failed tests, and that's all been discovered since the Grenfell tragedy.
Disbelief. That's a simple, because we've lost lives. If we cannot replace lives, we mustn't allow that to happen again. So for that basic, very basic test to say it must be at least 30 minutes, you must give any occupant 30 minutes of protection for the door. If we cannot implement that, then we are looking after the animals in the zoo better than the humans we have in social housing.
It seems like yesterday we were talking about Grenfell when it happened, but of course time has gone on, but not a great deal of time. Don't you think we have to consider time and money will eventually resolve this sort of problem?
Oh, we've had enough time. I mean, if this was another financial crisis, they would have called an emergency, or declared a state of emergency. We've had lives that we cannot replace. And yet we're still thinking 12 months later, 18 months later. No, we've had enough time. We've not prioritized housing, and we think housing is an optional extra. Health, housing, and education should be on the same level. I've always believed that. My submission to the Secretary of State for Housing was along those lines. You cannot think that housing is anyhow and somehow less important than education or health.
Therefore, the need for a powerful watchdog overseeing social housing. Why aren't we seeing one already being set up? Is that what you would advocate?
And yes, it has to be totally independent of the government. If I was the minister, I would have, just like you have the Bank of England, totally independent of the Treasury. We should have an independent watchdog that looks seriously at this, because there's so much conflict of interest if you allow any other body that now comes under the Ministry of Housing to now supervise itself. I mean, it's impossible.
What about, you talk about the government, what about councils themselves? What sort of responsibility should they be taking?
I see the council as an extension of government, whether it be local government or national government. If I was right now the Minister for Housing, that's the first thing I'll be thinking about. And that's the first thing I honestly ought to have been done, because we don't have any reasons right now. At least the legacy, one of the legacies should be there is a robust system that supervises and checks what is being done and compares that with the law that we think we met for the law to achieve. Because if we're not achieving our goals, then we're just playing hot air.
You're following the Grenfell inquiry very closely, very much involved.
Yes.
You talk about what should be done. Are you seeing things, though, being done as a result of what's emerging from the inquiry?
Very little. A lot of great speeches, brilliant proposals, but nothing has radically changed in response, in direct response to what we saw on the 14th of June. Because we need to do things in direct response to that. We need to hear what the residents are saying. There should be a resident voice. Because if you listen to, I always thought that they said the customer was king. In this case, sadly, quote unquote, the customer is a tenant. So why can't we listen to the tenant? So I will, if I was on the board of any of the social housing corporation, that's one thing I would want to do. Let me speak to the tenants that are living in the house and let them tell me what they are really feeling and what they are seeing.
Well, Shelter, the charity, is saying that there's a requirement for 3 million more homes, social housing. Are you concerned that if even a small fraction of those are being built, they're not going to meet the safety standards, that we could be looking at other Grenfells in the future?
That's one thing I probably might have to congratulate the current government for. They have lifted the ban on local authority borrowing money to build houses. So there is no excuse anymore. You have the money, you can build it, then go ahead and build it. There shouldn't be a shortfall at all. Because the reasons why there was a shortfall originally was because they couldn't borrow to build. Now you're allowed to borrow to build. I really don't see why anyone will go in that direction.
Despite your concerns, and you feel that there's simply not there is a lack of action at the moment as the inquiry unfolds, do you have hope that lessons will be learned from Grenfell and that despite the tragedy there will be positives coming out of this in the future?
I always have to believe that tomorrow is going to be better than today, so I have to hope, and that's the reason why we keep saying it, we keep advocating, at every opportunity given to us, we say it, because I believe we've not said it loud enough. That's probably why they've not heard it. There are other national priorities. I take that as a valid case. There are other national priorities, but life and cash cannot be equaled. If this was a financial crisis, the reaction would have been swifter. Because it's a human crisis, we must move as fast as we'll do with cash.
Professor Chris Imafidon, thank you very much indeed for joining us
You're
here on
welcome.
RTK.
Thank you.